One, you're here at AWS number 3 with ways to advocate. As we all get in this uh, webinar, I want everyone to take a quick peek at the chat. There is, similar to the last 2 times, if you were here, a sign-in sheet to make sure that we are keeping track of everybody that's in today's session. So it's under that AWS sign-in sheet link. All you got to do is just put your name. So please do that before we do anything else. And I think everybody is good, but make sure you have your microphones muted until the discussion portion, and then feel free to hop in there with the discussion, unmute yourself. But I'll just be the speaker and myself for now. Glad to have everybody here today. We'll let people funnel on in. If you're like me, sometimes you get to a session and then you're right there right at the beginning and logging in. So we'll wait while people get signed in there, and make sure, by the way, just as a backup with the sign-in sheet, if you have your Zoom name changed to say your email, if you could kindly just change that to your first and last name as well, just so we're checking both the sign-in sheet and the Zoom list to make sure everybody is accounted for. So especially for the high school counselors, that you get your certificate and such, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. All right, and it looks like that we are recording, so I'll get started here as we get everybody in. So I wanted to just introduce myself again quickly. So most of you know me, you've been here for the other sessions with AWS. I'm Brandon Curry, one of the co-chairs of the Government Relations Committee, along with Karina Contreras-Nunez. She is the person behind the scenes today, and I'm your host. But I wanted to thank you for being here. We are in our 3rd session, believe it or not, of our Advocacy webinar series. Today's session we've entitled Ways to Advocate, and we'll be having our speaker from our 2nd session, David Hawkins, and he was tremendous during our last time around. So we are having him back to talk about the ways and means to advocate. So just as a recap for people, we had our first AWS session on the overview of the state legislative system. We had the immediate past chair of GRC, Kay Kaufman, who's now at the University of Indianapolis, talking about just the overview of how things look like at the state level with our House and Senate. That was really informative. And then the 2nd session, AWS number 2, was values and missions on a state and national level, where David really talked about how we have some state and national guidelines and goals and missions that we are trying to achieve. And so now we're in that 3rd session, again, talking about issues and ways to advocate. And then that'll go right into AWS number 4, which make sure it's on your calendars. We do have an invite sent out through Outlook, so it should be there. But it's on January 28th, again at 12 p.m. On understanding proposed bills. That's with Courtney Hott, who is the Secondary School Issues Committee Chair for INACAC, and very importantly is the Director of Legislation and Program Implementation at the Indiana Commission for Higher Education. So make sure that you attend that. For those who are especially school counselors and earning your certificate and points when it comes to the professional growth plan points, make sure that you are doing the things you need to do there. Please make sure that if this is a session that, say, you're viewing this and you're doing the recording, make sure that you send a brief synopsis of the topics to Vanessa Gibson. She can put her email in the chat here, gibsonv@purdue.edu. She's keeping track of the certificate progression, so make sure to touch base with her about your certificate status if you have questions, and the professional growth plan points for those of you who are the school, not the school counselor side of things, but the admissions counselor side of things. You can also get that certificate too, so make sure that you're keeping up on that. And the presentations were attached to be an email sent out by Karina this week as well. Let us know if you did not receive it. But without further ado, we'll get started here. So again, this is a session of ways to advocate on building people's knowledge of the legislative system and building upon that, what we've learned with the NACAC values, and learning about simple and effective ways that we can advocate and that really anyone can do. So I'll highlight our speaker here. So again, David Hawkins, Executive Director for Educational Content and Policy at NACAC, and I'll let him take it away.
Okay, thank you, Brandon, and thanks everybody for having me back for a second engagement here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see the PowerPoint that I've pulled together for today. So let me pull that up. There we go. Karini and Brandon, just a quick thumbs up. Can you all see that? Yep, okay.
Yes, I would just put it on presentation mode if possible.
Exactly, yep, here it goes. Yeah, slowly. There we are. Okay.
Thank you.
So yes, and as I go through this, I definitely want to be able to pause for questions. In screen share mode, I can only see a few faces. So either feel free to just speak out, blurt anything out, or Brandon and Karini, if you see a burning question that I'm not seeing, just throw me a sign or something like that, and I'll be happy to pause. So I thought this was I thought, Brandon, your description of part 4 was an excellent lead in to what I was going to talk about right at the start. So I'm going to try to provide an overview of policy advocacy for you and the ways that you can engage in this endeavor. But the thing that I want you to keep in mind all throughout this is that you are the expert. And a lot of the reason I say that is because I have been a part of every legislative event for the last 20 years at NACAC, and I've watched people come through DC, first timers, veterans, you name it. And what always strikes me is that the first timers who come in are so nervous about doing policy advocacy, and we say you're the expert. We prep. We go through sessions to talk about content that we'll be sharing on Capitol Hill. But ultimately, what it always boils down to is that it's your experience on your job that makes you the expert. Nobody, there are very few people in DC. I mean, even people like me who work in DC who know everything about every policy, every procedure, every in or out of the legislative process. Nobody expects you as a volunteer who have a day job, a real job outside of what you're doing now, to be the expert on all of that. What you are the expert in, though, is what you see every day, and that is really critical. And the reason I think about all of those people who've come through our legislative conferences is that to a person, they will be so nervous about going up to Capitol Hill to meet with a member of Congress or a legislative staffer. And we tell them that, that they want to hear from you. They want to know what your challenges are on the job. And I think they just don't believe us until they actually get in there and they do the job. And I've been in on those meetings. And our members are some of the best advocates that you'll ever see. And that includes you. So I just want you to keep that in mind, particularly as you head out of this one and into part 4, as you get into some of the technical aspects of interpreting legislation and all that stuff. Just got to keep in mind, it's what you know every day that makes you the expert. And that's what you can contribute to the legislative process. So as we go through this presentation today, we're gonna start with 6 words that are essential to any advocacy pitch. We're going to start, and we're going to follow that by talking about how important it is to make an introduction. Very basic thing, but it's a really important thing. Then we're going to go talk about a little bit about how to advocate for issues. What you typically will do as you make pitches or you ask for specific policy measures. And then we'll talk a little bit at the end about collaboration and how to amplify your efforts. So I can't take credit for this 6 words essential to any advocacy pitch. I was on a Zoom call a couple of weeks ago, and Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois was on the call, and he said that a mentor of his once told him that the 6 most important words in any advocacy pitch are "Let me tell you a story." And I'll say that appeals to pretty much everybody in the policy world. Again, your expertise is based on what you do and what you see. So a lot of what we talked about during the last session were the issue priorities that we have as NACAC. And I think you probably saw that those issue priorities were so closely aligned to what you do and see every day. The fact that you see inequities in, let's say, access to K-12 college preparatory curriculum. You see the disparities in the student to counselor ratios. You see the disparities in terms of students' ability to afford college. I mean, these are things that you directly observe on a daily basis. All we do is build them up into our policy asks and align them with the kinds of programs that are either in place or the kinds that we want to see in place. So really your storytelling is going to be really critical. And as you see here, this is one of our members who came to Capitol Hill just this past March. And you can see the smile on her face after coming out of a legislative meeting. She was all full of confidence and just so excited about what she had just done. So that can and will be you at some point. So let's talk a little bit about the introduction. This is a kind of an underrated part of the process. The first thing that you want to make sure to do is convey who you are, where you work, or who you represent. And I've included some pictures down here at the bottom that are a little cryptic, but the one on the left there is the late Senator George Voinovich from Ohio. And the way he relates to this introductory process is that during a very early legislative conference at NACAC, some of our members from Ohio went up to his office and didn't meet with him in person, but met with his legislative director. And through that basic introduction, there were, I think, 3 people from Ohio. One of the people happened to work at the high school where this legislative director had attended. And the legislative director had very fond memories of his school counselor because she helped him really get on the path to college. Well, as it turns out, sadly, that counselor had just recently passed away. And the legislative director didn't know that. So he was like on the spot, visibly moved, and basically said, I will do whatever I can to help you achieve your legislative priority, which at the time was that we were trying to get school counselors to be eligible for professional development under the No Child Left Behind Act. At the time that the bill was in the draft stage, counselors were not eligible for professional development using that money. So this legislative director took the issue to his boss, Senator Voinovich. Senator Voinovich said, that's fine, let's go with it. And they were our champions for a good year and a half. And we ended up getting that language into the No Child Left Behind Act. Not the best bill ever written, but at least our little piece of it was in there. And it all boiled down to the introduction, to just understanding that here I am. He was ready to make the offer to help before he even knew what we were advocating for. So that's a really powerful statement in my mind about just how those basic human sort of things affect the legislative process, and it will affect your relationships that you start to build. Once you get beyond that really basic level of familiarity, we talk about sort of a layer of things you could propose that don't even involve policy at all. You can see down here in the middle, I've pulled a graphic from a congressman's webpage who does a service academy night. And a lot of members of Congress will do those because they necessarily involve recommendations from members of Congress. But what a lot of members of Congress also like to do are things like financial aid nights for their constituents or college application nights and all sorts of things beyond our field. But what they really love to be able to do is provide some value for their constituents. So if the mood strikes you, if you feel like you've got a good relationship or you want to build a good relationship with a legislator at any level, state or federal, you can always offer, hey, we have some real expertise here that could be of service to your constituents. And if you'd like to do a financial aid or college admission night, we've got the volunteers that can help you, because Lord knows we don't need members of Congress telling people how to apply to college. They need us to tell them how to apply to college. So I've lost count of the number of these things that our members have done in conjunction with state or federal legislators over the years, and it really builds a strong relationship. I know one example was from Pennsylvania, where we did a financial aid and college application night with a member of Congress, And that built a legislative relationship. They started coming to us for advice on bills. We ended up championing an amendment that they proposed that ended up getting enacted into law. uh, Years and years go by. Their former staffers are now, one of them was with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, another was with the Department of Education. And to this day, I'm still in touch with these people. And it was because our members went in and offered, hey, you want to do one of these financial aid nights? And it just created that relationship. So a great way to just, and again, keeping it above this policy level. We're not even into the ask yet. We're still at this level of, here we are, here's what we can do for you. The final element of an introduction, I think, is that next step of how can we help inform your policy needs? Because any member of any legislature is going to be hard pressed to have complete information about any issue that they're dealing with. And they really do need the outside help. That's why people like me, organizations like NACAC, and our allies in Washington and in the state capitals are so critical to the functioning of legislatures, that they, when they are dealing with a bill that pertains to college access, they actually have to talk to people who do college access for a living because they don't know all of the issues. So an example of that here at the bottom is our past president, Jane Fonash, who had developed a relationship with a Senate office, and the Senate Finance Committee, where this senator was held a committee assignment, was going to talk about tax breaks for education and tax policy. And they wanted to know, why don't more people take advantage of these tax breaks? Well, aside from the fact that a lot of people don't benefit from tax breaks in general, that was something that got covered. There was also the issue of who actually even knows that these tax breaks exist. And so Jane went up and talked in a very authoritative fashion about how school counselors, the IRS doesn't communicate to school counselors. There's just not a channel there. And consequently, school counselors don't know anything about, well, not all school counselors. By and large, based on some survey research that we had done, school counselors are not aware of tax credits for education. They're not aware of the details. They don't feel comfortable helping students. And she was clearly the hit of that hearing, because you had senators asking Jane, you mean counselors don't get any information about this stuff from the IRS? And Jane said, no. Why? I've never received anything from the IRS outside of my own taxes. So that's the kind of thing that ends up producing results. And again, it's all just from this very introductory phase. But it underscores how you are the experts, about how this is how you start making these inroads. This is another example from Senator Durbin about how our members and our staff have sort of helped inform this process of just sharing information with constituents. This is a message he sends out actually every year. He sent it out every year for the last 10 years or so, just warning professionals who work in schools about unscrupulous for-profit colleges. And you can see in the little red box below, our name is down there along with a lot of other associations. But what not many people know about this is that we were the organization that first thought of this idea of having elected officials send these letters out. And we had actually drafted the letter that he still uses to this day to send out to his constituents. And all these other organizations are part of an alliance that we work with, or several alliances that we work with. And we had actually asked them if they would mind signing on to this original letter. So 10 years down the road, here it is. He doesn't even consult us anymore. He just does this on his own, and there's our names in there, and we dutifully share it with our members too. So these are ways in which you can sort of, if there's an idea you want to share and you think everybody should know about it, it's worth sharing it with a legislative staffer or a member of a state legislature or federal legislature. They may end up saying, hey, yeah, we should tell our constituents about that. And if you'll write it for us, we'll send it out. So these are some of the things that you can do. Before I go into sort of the ways you can start dipping into the issue advocacy element of this, are there any questions or thoughts you want to share? And Brandon, I'll look to you to give me a move along, or there's a question. If we're good? Okay. All right, so then once you get beyond this introductory phase, you get into the person-to-person contact, and these are the three major ways. And there's a lot more depth to all of this, but so I'm just giving you kind of an overview today. But the first level is sort of calling or emailing a legislative office. And while a lot of offices are not necessarily going to take your verbatim message and share it with the legislator, what's important is that they monitor the volume of these things that they get. So if they start getting a flood of emails or a flood of calls about a given issue, that's going to pop on the radar screen. They're going to say, "Hey, we got to do something about the student to counsel ratio. Everybody's calling us. They're trying to get us to do something." And then that's where the personal relationship might start to pay off. The legislative staffer might say, "Ah, right, school counseling. Well, I've got an expert on the Rolodex that I can call, and we can ask them about what we're supposed to do about this issue." The virtual visits or in-person visits, that's obviously a step up from the calls or emails. That's where you actually go and meet with a staffer or a member of the legislature. That's where the storytelling starts to really come into play. You're gonna have the opportunity to lay out a case, and ideally you're going to have the opportunity to make an ask. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But that obviously requires a little more preparation. They can be very effective because they tend to stick. An email is just an email, whereas a visit, the person will actually have a memory of this experience. And then finally, the idea of asking a member of a legislature to make a speech or to visit your school or campus is another way to engage on an issue front. Oftentimes, if you know that the legislator is good on an issue, they can be a very compelling speaker, whether it's to the association, so at one of your conferences, or even in a school or campus setting, where you might provide them with an audience to hear what they have to say. Because if politicians love one thing, it's getting their message out. So the opportunity to facilitate that can actually work to your advantage, especially if it's someone who's done a lot of good things that you really want to reward and encourage to do more. So those are some of the things that you can certainly do, and there's a lot of infrastructure at NACAC that can help support this in affiliates or even at the federal level. So I'd encourage you to when you think about those things, if you run into an element of this that you're unfamiliar with or need help with, that's what we're here to do. We're here to help you. So count on us for that. As you do consider meeting with a legislative staffer or a member, here's a few things that are helpful to think about. Being prompt and concise are really critical, because legislators typically, their schedules are really ugly, and they will have maybe 15 minutes to sit with you. So being prompt and being ready to deliver a short message is going to be really critical. Having a game plan is also important. Obviously, you have to think about what you're going to say ahead of time, and you almost want to think through, how do I want this to go? What is success going to look like coming out of this meeting? And then you structure your questions accordingly. You want to make sure that you get your pitch across. You want to make sure you at least tell a little bit of story, right? And you also want to adapt, because you never know when you walk in what you're going to get. It's possible that that you were expecting to meet with a member, and that member had to go and run to do something, so you get stuck with a staffer. Or perhaps maybe in advance that this member has been really good on your issues, so you don't have to do a lot of the educating. You just have to go in with a more thank you approach, and here's what more we can do together. And then, of course, you might have an instance where the legislator is not going to be receptive to your cause. Then you might want to craft a message that acknowledges that. It just says, look, I know that we may not see always eye to eye on these issues, but let me share how this affects me as your constituent. And let me tell you how it affects some of the people in your district. And then, they can take that and do whatever they want with it. Being professional, I don't think I have to tell this group to be professional. You all are in front of students and families all the time, and you know how important it is to be professional. Being prepared for anything. As I said, these meetings can sometimes go in weird directions. In fact, my favorite story is one year in DC, I went to a meeting with a representative from New York with some of our New York State ACAC volunteers, and the staffer, her body language suggested that she was less interested in this meeting than perhaps anything she'd ever done in her entire life. She was slouching like this. She had this really bored look on her face. And we walked out of that office, and this is what we thought was a friendly office, because the member himself had been a financial aid officer at a college, and we just thought if there was ever going to be a friendly audience, it was going to be this one. And we walked out of there thinking that we had just struck out so badly. But I have an interesting follow-up to that, which kind of gets to my last point about following up. Once you've done a meeting with someone, it's always helpful to follow up with them, because again, their schedules are really bad. They tend to have a lot more information coming at them than they can possibly absorb. So the more you can do to cultivate that communication, the better off you're going to be. There's a certain euphoria after you finish the meeting. You're like, yes, I did it. Now I don't have to do that again. But it's important to then send that thank you note to say, hey, listen, I know your time is precious. Ideally, they should thank you too, because your time is precious and you did this outside of the confines of your job and they didn't. So, but ideally, it's nice to be able to thank them for their time and to remind them that, hey, here's what we're looking for and here's how we can help you. So let's go back to the story about being prepared for anything and the slouching staffer. You could imagine my surprise when a week after the meeting with this staffer from New York and our New York State ACAC people that my phone rings, and it's this staffer. And at the time, we were peddling a bill called the Pathways to College Act, which you can see right here. We had written it in conjunction with a legislative office on the Senate side. And it really was all about hiring, training, and equipping school counselors and college advisors to help students make the transition. It was tailor-made for us. In fact, tailor-made because we wrote the bill. So that was one of our asks. We wanted people to support or sponsor this bill. So imagine my surprise a week later when this slouching staffer calls me and said, my congressman would like to sponsor your bill. You could have knocked me over with a feather. And as you can see in the little red box at the top, this is Tim Bishop, who is now no longer in Congress, but he was the member who used to be a financial aid officer, so this fit really well with him. You can see they took the Pathways to College Act name, right? And I underlined our name in the bill, because when you write a bill, you get to put your own name in it if you want to. So that was amazing. And he did so much work for us. And this staffer went on to do other jobs after this in the Senate. She was in the House at the time. And it was a relationship that lasted for years until she finally left and went on to get her PhD. So you just never know what's going to come out of these visits. So we're moving quickly across some of this stuff. Does anybody have any questions about that personal visit, that sort of how to go about that? No, none. Okay. Let's see. I see something.
Wait, David.
Yes,
I
I
just put
can't see
something in the chat. So I have a quick question for you. We're beginning the planning stages for a virtual advocacy day at the moment. And we're just wondering, how do we translate these tips into a virtual environment? Like, are there any key modifications that you suggest we make?
I'll go back a slide or two here. This is even more critical in the virtual context. The mechanics of all of it is largely the same. You're going to contact the state legislative office. You're going to request an appointment. They're going to tell you, so there's that whole process of setting the meeting up. But when it comes to the Zoom format, I guess some of it depends on whether you're going to be by yourself or whether you're going to be in a group. If you're in a group, it becomes really critical for this game plan to be in place. So the idea that you're going to quickly introduce yourselves and your school, you're gonna talk a little bit about Indiana ACAC as an organization, and then you're going to go into your pitch. So that's just an example. And you're going to designate, if there's 3 people on the call, person 1 is going to hit this issue, person 2 this one, and person 3 this one. And then we're going to stop and we're going to say, do you have any questions? And then they ask their questions, and then we're going to say, thank you for meeting with us. We'll be back in touch. Please let us know if you have any questions in the interim. It's that kind of thing that in the virtual format becomes really important. I've sat in on a lot of virtual calls with staff from Capitol Hill, and that is, if you don't have that, the meetings get really messy, and it's the staffer. You can almost tell the staffer gets a little frustrated, and you just, it starts to fall apart. So that structure is really critical. In some ways, the Zoom format is a little more like, it's almost more fun because you can also, instead of handing them a whole bunch of papers, if there's stuff that, if the staffer has a question, "Oh, I don't even know where I'd get this information," you can shoot something into the chat and say, "Oh, here's a link where you can find that," or "Here's a link to Indiana ACAC," or whatever the case may be. So in some ways, there's more flexibility to it.
That's really great advice. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, I'll go down here. I'm going to look at the time. Brandon, we want to leave what, about 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes, 15 minutes?
Oh, basically, we do have that hour, and so you can go as long as you like there, and then we'll have some discussion afterward.
Got it. Okay, wonderful. So we're going to now go into, so we've talked about making a basic introduction, which can either happen in the in-person meeting, or it can be an email or phone call, or any sort of way in which you think an introduction is appropriate. We've gone through the process of talking about how you should meet, how you should structure a meeting. And by the way, I should say, back to the point of the meeting, part of having the game plan and having your asks down is feeling confident in your knowledge of the subject matter. And certainly another thing that I'm here to work with you all on, if you need it, is providing backup documentation for your asks. So any research, any talking points, any policy papers about school counseling, financial aid, college access, what have you, we can generally either provide you with what we already have, or we can even create new information. So having that, having some handoffs to offer can be helpful. Particularly if you do have a hard ask. Sometimes if it's just a getting to know you meeting, the real deliverable will just be, we want to convey who we are and how we can be helpful. But if you're in there for a policy meeting, you clearly want to say, look, we want a ratio, I'm just pulling this out of the air, we want a ratio of 250 counselors to one student at every public high school in Indiana. That's a big ask. There can be a lot of research that goes behind that, and we can help provide that. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention that to you. So you've gone beyond, then you've sort of met with the member, you've established that beachhead. The next thing that you can think about is a social media strategy. And this is going to, again, we're really sort of going at a high level over a lot of this stuff. There's so much we can do in these areas, but generally with social media, there's three ways to kind of get attention. Number one is direct advocacy, where it's mainly just, the point of your tweeting or posting to social media is to get a member, get an elected official's attention. And I don't know of many elected officials who are sitting there monitoring their own social media accounts. Maybe at the state level, there might be some. Generally speaking, though, it's their aides, it's their media folks, it's their legislative assistants, whoever's helping them just sort of keep in track with keep up with the news. So and I'm going to offer some examples of how these things work. But so there's that idea of, hey, we want your attention. Social media, here we go. Collective advocacy is also something that happens pretty frequently through social media, where you do things like social media, like Twitter storms, or I would include petition drives under this category, where the point is to not just make noise, not just to say, hey, here's something you ought to know about, but hey, here's something you ought to know about, and there's an awful lot of us out here thinking about it. So that gets kind of back to that volume issue, like this is a way to turn up the volume. And then finally, there's the storytelling aspect of social media. And I think that, again, going back to what I mentioned earlier about legislative staff, particularly not knowing everything about the issues, social media is kind of a good way to make sure that you're tagging elected officials on stories that might be of interest. In fact, a lot of what I do out of my own Twitter account at NACAC, the NACAC Wonk account, is to tweet out news stories to make sure that people understand what the issues are. I could choose to focus exclusively on just NACAC produced tweets, but I don't, because it doesn't give as much context as it does when you see an article in the New York Times or the Chronicle of Higher Ed that really lays out the crux of the problem. Then it's really easy for me to go back and say, oh, by the way, if you want to know how to fix this problem, check out NACAC here, and I'll link to some policy proposal that we might have. So those are three major ways in which social media comes into play as you think about what you can do as an advocate. And on this slide, I've given you some examples of how social media starts to play out. And I feel a little silly because there's so much more depth to social media these days. But these are just a few examples. The first in the top left is that direct advocacy model where I'm tagging 2 members of Congress who co-sponsored a resolution designating November as National College Application Month. Just a real simple thank you. And that's kind of on that level of introduction or that real cultivation level where you're not really talking about issues, but you're just thanking them for the good work they've done. And you see here I've tagged the 2 affiliates where these members of Congress come from, which means that they can then amplify and retweet. And then just in the back of their head, they know if I go to a meeting with either Representative Wild or Representative Guthrie, I'll know that they've supported this. And so that's this is just a real concise, concentrated way to get information out to multiple audiences at the same time. If you go over to the right and you see the latest updates language there, and then you keep scrolling over to your right and you see the little NACAC Wonk logo on the right, this is a screen grab from a web page that actually we don't run. This is a coalition that we belong to that helps protect students from unscrupulous colleges. And they have embedded a hashtag on the right, the hashtag Defend Students slogan. And that's kind of a quick way of sort of alerting people as to what you're trying to do, defend students. But what's really cool about this is every time I put out a tweet that talks about our issues related to protecting students, I just slip that hashtag on there and it goes straight to that website. So in addition to my primary audience that can see these tweets, it goes to a secondary audience on this web page, and it just helps amplify. There's something like 40 or 50 organizations that belong to this coalition, and they can see these and they can kind of take a look and amplify them, which helps get our message out.
Yeah,
Going
Dave,
down. Oh yeah, go ahead, Brandon.
we had a question in the chat here that definitely relates to what you're talking about here.
Yeah.
This is from Janiyah Downing, current president of the Indiana ACAC. Happy to have him on the call. But he had a great question where he asked, should we be using our personal accounts or work accounts for this type of tagging and interaction online? I know a lot of counselors have both a work account that they use. It's very professional, and then they have the personal ones, and sometimes there's department ones as well.
Yeah, great question, and that actually pertains to a lot more than just social media. So I'm glad you asked the question. But let's hold it to social media for now. The bottom line is, when in doubt, use personal resources. Unless your school or institution is espousing a specific policy position and has given you permission to amplify that position through your work accounts, it's always safer to just do it with your personal accounts. And that we've seen that over the years, even with people coming to DC to visit with their members of Congress. Oftentimes they have to say, because their institution isn't necessarily endorsing all of the positions that NACAC endorses, they have to say, look, I'm here. I work at the University of X or X high school, but I belong to this professional association. So I'm here advocating for my own professional principles through them. Now, there are times, like let's take an issue like the Pell Grant. I don't know an institution in America that's not behind the Pell Grant. So you may be able to use institutional accounts to amplify messages like that. But it's always safe, and in fact, the safest thing to do is always just ask a legal counsel on campus or a principal or a school leader if it's appropriate. And here's where this tweet in the bottom left, the MHHS counseling tweet, this is one where there's an intersection where you have NACAC. They are retweeting a tweet that I put out about why we support school counselors, why what we advocate for with school counselors. Clearly, this school has retweeted this out of their school account. And so there are some issues where, of course, we want to advocate for school counselors, right? I'm not advocating for something really controversial here. So there are people who do use their school accounts to amplify some of our advocacy messages. But there are other tweets that I put out, and I don't have any copied on this presentation. I can be pretty snarky sometimes on the wonk, and I can imagine that MHHS counseling is not going to post a lot of those. So, and I don't blame them for it. In fact, I'm glad they don't, because I don't want to get into trouble.
Appreciate the sense of humor, though, David.
So it really is kind of a case by case, that you got to use a lot of personal judgment. But whenever you are in doubt, it is safer to use your constitutionally given right to free speech with your own account. So this last tweet here is just an example. The one from the Committee for Education Funding is an example of an effort. This again is one of our coalitions that we belong to, and they pretty often do Twitter storms. And so all of the 60 plus organizations that are involved will put out tweets that contribute to this Hear Our Ed Stories hashtag that you see here. And it does generate a lot of tweets. And I know that the people on Capitol Hill understand when these happen and understand that, okay, all right, we get it. And even if they don't, even if they're not supportive, or if they don't necessarily do exactly what we want them to, the point is that they see them, they know we're out there. So that if they when they are thinking about policy, they have to understand, oh, right, there's that whole group of crazy people that tweet us every month. And I don't mean really crazy people, but that's part of the objective of this social media process. So before I go into the last full category here, before we get to collaboration, is there any other questions about social media?
There isn't a question about social media, but there is a question from AJ Frigo, one of our committee members. And I'm going to ask it. Is it our responsibility to come up with ways to solve the issues we bring up? Is it better to have ideas ready, or just leave it up to the legislates to decide how to best solve the problem?
Great question. And that's a question we get fairly frequently on our Hill days. You as an individual volunteer should almost never feel the need to have the solution in your pocket. Your expertise is in identifying the challenges. That's number one. Now, there's a footnote or a caveat to that. If you're doing something at your school, at your institution, or if you know of an effort that's been particularly successful, there's always room for you to say, hey, we had this challenge at our school, and I know a lot of other schools do too, and here's what we did to solve it. Now, let's take, for example, we're a well-resourced high school, and we know there's other schools that can't do what we did. But if you took our model and enabled other schools to do it, I'll bet you their problems would be solved too. That's the case in which I think we would encourage you to offer those kinds of ideas, that we know how to do this right. We know how to solve this problem in our school or in our setting. And in those cases, the issue really is just that we need, you as the legislator should be helping other people get access to these tools that we use to solve this problem. But when it comes to really difficult questions, there's times when you might go up and say, hey, we want to double the Pell Grant, because right now it only pays for less than a quarter of public college tuition. We think it needs to cover 100% of all costs at a 4-year college. So let's get that thing up there. And a staffer, particularly one who's not supportive of the thing, will say, well, how are we going to pay for it? That's the point at which you go, isn't that your job? I'm just here to tell you that there's a need, and that if we don't fill the need, things aren't going to get better. So, I don't work in Congress. I don't know the congressional budget or appropriations process. And I'm putting myself in the shoes of someone who's coming in as a constituent. Now, I might be a different story when I go in and meet. I might have some ideas about where they can find that revenue. And when we do, we typically try to publish it in our issue papers. And that's the point at which, as a constituent, you can say, my organization has some ideas that I think you'd be interested in, and that's a great opportunity for a follow-up. So answering questions on the spot, being made to feel responsible for solving the whole problem that you bring in is not one of your main responsibilities. You have me to back you up on that. So a great way, we always tell people to say, that's a good question. Our organization has some information that we think can be helpful, and we'll follow up with you on that. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Thank you, David.
Sure. And I will say, just to reiterate, that's what I'm here for. So anytime you feel like you're stuck, oh, right, there's that guy, David, over there in Washington. He can help us out. So just remember that. So as we go into to this last full category here, earned media, this is a way to kind of advocate around the process. And I think, it's one that really can put you into conversations that don't always happen when you're in these face-to-face conversations. So when I say earned media, this is the kind of media that you have to work for. So letters to the editor, you have to write into response. I don't know who reads letters to the editor anymore, but it's an example of earned media. Op-eds, those, you've seen op-eds, and with blogs in the new media, which is the last bullet point down there, this op-ed style of advocacy has really exploded over the years. So there's a lot more outlets, there's a lot more ways that you can get ideas published. And then sort of in conjunction with our social media approach, tagging reporters. Usually if you go to a website, if you're reading an article online, you can click on the reporter's name and you might get to a little bio page, or they might even at the bottom of the article say you can reach so-and-so on Twitter at, their Twitter handle. It's really kind of useful whenever you read an article that you're interested in to kind of note, oh, if I ever had an idea, could I tweet to that reporter and have him or her sort of notice me or understand what I'm trying to say and maybe consult me as an expert down the road? Or if I have a story idea, hey, you wrote this story on college access, you ought to see what's happening over here at my school. Those are ways in which advocacy becomes real. And when it hits the newspapers, you can be guaranteed that legislators are going to read it, because that's one thing they pay close attention to is what happens in the media. This is an example of something we did a couple of years ago. We put out state student to counselor ratio levels in a comprehensive report along with ASCA, the American School Counseling Association. And I was down at a conference when we released it, and I stayed up, probably half the night doing these personalized tweets. And on the left here, you see we picked out the Arizona numbers because they're one of the worst states in the country when it comes to student to counselor ratios. And I tagged a bunch of people at the Arizona Republic, which is online at arizonacentral.com. And the dates are a little different there, February in 2018 to August 2018. So you could see it took some time to percolate, but they eventually wrote a story about the ratio of students to counselors in Arizona. And we bugged the crap out of them on social media. So the February one was the first time we had done it, and we just continued to hit and hit and hit. And we got a story finally. And when you do get something like that, that then enables you to start reaching out to legislators and say, hey, did you see this story? They may not know that you're the one that that pushed the reporters to write about it, but you can say, hey, look at that. The Arizona Republic reported on the student to counselor ratio problem in Arizona. What are we going to do about that, I wonder? Man, maybe we ought to meet and I can talk to you about what I think we should do. So it becomes this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that if you start this ball rolling, it just starts to take on a life of its own. Let's see. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Is there a question, Karini?
Yes, there is a question.
Sure.
So we have another question, and it's, how do we better understand the scale of big asks versus a small ask? What does a big ask look like compared to a small one? Is there a best practice on how many big asks to bring up?
There really isn't. I mean, I'm taking that question in reverse order. There really isn't best practice. I mean, to some degree, the confines of the meeting that you're in will dictate that you can't have a list that's as long as your arm. So ultimately, you will want to go in with maybe a fairly discrete number. In fact, I used to work in political campaigns, and there's an old maxim that says you get to talk about 3 things in a campaign, and you're lucky if the voters remember one of them. So that might be a way of thinking about what you're presenting to a legislator. If you come up with 3 big ideas or 3 ideas in general, if they glom onto one of them, you'll have scored a victory. In terms of defining a big ask, in the previous presentation, I mentioned that we were talking about education, higher education as a public good. A really big ask is we think public higher education ought to be free, just like public K-12 school. That's a huge ask. And I think that's one of those things where you can say, look, this is our big goal. We want this up here. What has to happen in order to achieve that, though, is it's like, for instance, and I'm just using this as an example, states have to be willing to fully fund public higher education. You really have to step up the appropriations. That's a big ask as well. If states had to appropriate enough money so that everybody could go to college for free, and let's even say everyone with a certain level of need could go to public 4-year college for free. That's a big appropriations ask. And you sort of maybe move down the scale a little bit. You say, well, we really think we want to move. So we know that's a big ask. How about if need-based aid kept pace with inflation? Like that's maybe a little bit lower down the line. We're maybe not going to be able to double the Pell Grant for this year. What if we just kept it? What if we just pegged it to inflation? That costs a little less. And then you move further down the scale. Okay, well, so you're feeling like you don't have enough money to pay for this. And I'm not suggesting that you settle for any of these things. I'm just using this as a way of sliding down the line. Congress had for years wrestled with college affordability, and they talked about these big issues, and they started to plinko down to this level, and then they realized, the FAFSA is really hard to fill out. It's really complicated. So that's an idea of a smaller ask, like, okay, well, let's just back up then. We've got students who can't even get into the existing financial aid program to take advantage of what little we do give. Well, how about if we make the form shorter? How about if we try to simplify it so that people don't, and an idea in my mind is, what if they just didn't have to fill it out at all? I mean, we have enough information from the IRS and other agencies that suggest that this family was eligible for free and reduced price lunch. They're going to be eligible for a Pell Grant. Why do they have to fill out another form? So that's an example of going from like the really big ask down to the smaller scale ask. And it all just depends on the situation that you're in. I think, when you all, let's take Indiana ACAC as a state initiative. If you all come up with the idea that, hey, we want to be asking for these 3 things, and as a committee you think, okay, well, these are our asks, this is the level we want to be at. It's really entirely up to you as to which level you aim for. I think you can argue that there's merits to asking people for smaller changes, because they might be more likely to happen, and they might, if you put them back to back with other small changes, they might get you to the interim phase and then to the larger phase. There's also a case to be made to say, look, we're not going to pull our punches. This is what we need to be. This is the end goal we need to be at, and we can help you figure out how to get there. But ultimately, public 4-year education needs to be free. So it's kind of, you could go either way.
Thank you, David.
Sure. And I'm realizing we're down a little on time, so let me just show you. Oh, we're almost at the end anyway. So, so really, as we look at this earned media thing, I've put a couple of examples up. One is an op-ed that I wrote a number of years back, and the reason I put it there is not because I wrote it necessarily. It's more that what happened after I wrote it. I had read an article in this publication, Diverse Issues in Higher Ed, and it was sort of a glowing article about how great this for-profit college was at serving underrepresented students. At the same time, I was aware of information that this very same college was actually was preying on these populations, was recruiting these populations under false pretenses, and students were leaving with way more debt than they would have had they gone to a nonprofit school, and it just was a train wreck. So I wrote this article just sort of out of a sense of, this magazine, you really ought to look at the other side of this. But what ended up happening was, yes, it got published. So, great, objective reach. But people saw it, and I started getting calls from other media. I started getting calls from legislative staff. I started getting on to panels that were talking about this issue. And it's really amazing how when you put yourself out there, and this can work both ways, mind you, because I also received calls from for-profit colleges who weren't too happy about what I was saying. It puts you into circulation. And so if you have an idea that you're really passionate about, write about it if you're comfortable doing that. And the one on the left here is something that I wanted to share, because I was doing almost the same presentation yesterday with some advocates in SACAC, specific to Florida. And I found this op-ed from the Orlando Sentinel. And the woman who wrote this article in support of the DREAM Act and DACA is a math teacher. And this is someone who doesn't have any policy expertise that I know of, at least. Maybe she does. But she's a math teacher. And what she knows is that she sees a lot of students, a lot of very bright students who come through her class and who do really well in school and are ready to just go and be successful and get into college and make something of themselves, but they can't. And so she just wrote what she felt. And lo and behold, it gets published in the Orlando Sentinel just a couple of weeks ago. And I'm betting that she's going to start getting calls from legislators or others who want to hear her perspective on this. So just an example that anybody who has a strong idea and who really wants to write about it could potentially get published. And that's something that I think can pay dividends down the line. So I'll just quickly show you this slide that I'll just leave you with the fact that for every issue we're involved in, there's a coalition to address it. And on any specific topic, there's another organization that we link to. And a lot of these organizations have state level affiliates that you can connect to. And if they don't, there are similar efforts in states that parallel particularly a lot of these coalition efforts that you see. And so there's always strength in numbers. And I just, as you start to think about your own advocacy, as you think about your advocacy as an organization, getting into coalitions is always a good idea. And I and NACAT can be of help. I can't tell you how many times we've gotten a call from an affiliate to say, hey, we're going to get involved in this issue. Who do you know that might also be involved in it? And then I'll reach out to the folks I know in DC and say, hey, who's your Indiana affiliate lead on this issue? And it'll just as simple as me sending it to the affiliate, and bam, the relationship starts. And we've seen so many good things. There's been so much joint programming over the years. We've seen joint legislative conferences in states with the school counselors, with the financial aid administrators, with the registrars. I mean, there's just so much going on out there. And you all may well be involved in this already. But that's just kind of the last point I wanted to make, which really ties, in addition to your individual efforts, getting to know the community, getting engaged in the community will inevitably lead you to more doors that'll open and more amplification of the issues that you care about. So I know we only have a few minutes. This is my last slide. Happy to answer any remaining questions. And also, please do feel free to email me if you have any questions. I'm happy to respond to you at any time.
Yeah, absolutely outstanding information, David. I mean, my head is just full of ideas now of what we can do as a committee. And so I want to do two things here. One, are you available for a few minutes after 1 o'clock here to answer a few questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, great, because I want to make sure that people have the opportunity to do that while also respecting people's time, ending our formal session here. So before we get into the Q&A portion, just to let people know, again, that if you are watching this live, remember there's nothing you have to do extra for the certificate. Just keep on doing what you're doing, attend the last session. Two, if you are watching this as a recording, make sure that you email Vanessa Gibson with just a paragraph about any of the things that David has talked about. And then also just remember our last AWS session is January 28th at 12 p.m. And then we'll be forthcoming with more information about state and national advocacy days in February and March. But for everyone else here, I mean, feel free to log off here. But if you have questions, and I know I do for David, feel free to stay on. So thank you everyone for attending. If you haven't already, make sure that you do use the sign-in sheet that's at the top of this chat so we can get everyone's names. Okay, that being said, let's see, we did have another question here with, let's see, it was Tracy Flowers that asked at her last institution, they did not want the counselors talking to media. So is there any advice that you might have to give our home institutions to explain the role of counselor advocates so they can best share those stories to media and other parties? So what's the best practice you could share with that?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that come to mind. Number one is that everybody has the freedom to express their views as a citizen of this country. So the first thing that I would probably do is get a firm understanding of how how extensive an institution's policy is, because legally it would be difficult for them to suggest that you can't say something about a policy issue that may not present a conflict of interest with what your job is. So like if you're working at a college and you say, I think colleges should be defunded, like maybe they have the ability to say, well, we don't really want you working for us if that's your idea. But if it's more just you would like to talk about how important counseling is, I think they would understand that outside of work that would be something that you could do. Now, when it comes to speaking with the media, like oftentimes I will get calls from reporters and I'll forward them to a counselor or an admission officer. Most of the time I know that the person can speak, like I get that. But if, let's say, you get a call from a reporter, or maybe I've referred them to you, it always just says, the reporter will always be willing to tell you what they're writing about, first of all. And they will absolutely understand if you have to check with your administration about whether you're able to respond to this. So asking, hey, what is it that you want to talk to me about? I need to share it with my administrator, and then I'll come back and if I can talk, I'll talk. There's also the idea that you can speak to reporters off the record. You might have seen movies or TV shows where people sling that terminology around, but there are two ways you can talk to reporters and not have them throw it back on you individually. The first is you can say to them, look, my school doesn't want me talking. Let's say there's an issue that you just think is absolutely critical, and maybe you disagree with your school, or maybe I'm not encouraging you to go and get in trouble with your schools. But I'll use myself. Let me use myself. Like, there's been times when I know NACAC can't be on the record saying something. But if a reporter asks me, I will say, let me go off the record, because maybe I want to point them in the direction of someone who can, or maybe I want to point to a body of information that they really need to tap into, but that they can't say NACAC said that they should be doing. I'll say, I got to go off the record. And that's completely off. Like, they can't even, they have to put their pens down. They're not allowed to even write. They just have to listen to what you say and understand what it is. And you should not show up in any of that. So there's off the record. Then there's on background. They can, you can say, I'd like to talk to you on background. So they can say, a source with knowledge of the subject said. You see that all the time in the news. A source close to the administration shared. You can actually do that. And then one last answer, and then I'll shut up. When it comes to things like op-eds, you can always write in advance and show it to a school and say, this is what I'd like to write. Do you have a problem with this? And if they do, say, well, then do you have a problem if I just publish it as John Q. Citizen or Jane Q. Citizen? And I'm using that both literally and metaphorically. Like, if it's David Hawkins, can I write it as myself outside of work? And if they say, we really think that presents a conflict, then maybe write it as John Q. Hawk. To publish it anonymously or something like that. So there's ways to get to that to that issue and be above board. I'm not encouraging anyone to get in trouble with their school, God forbid.
No, that is great information and alternatives to just going directly, through your Twitter or what have you, or through letters to the editor. I mean, there's alternatives to
Sure.
make sure that you're contacting the people that needs to hear that message. Tracy says, thank you, very, very helpful.
Sure.
Oh my gosh, dude. If you have any other questions, please feel free to keep them in the chat here, or just say them. I mean, that is the kind of free flow time just to ask questions. I have a question, by the way, David.
Sure.
So you mentioned and included in the slides even those screenshots of Twitter. Is that the best social media platform to use, or is like Facebook, Instagram, or are those also useful?
Good question. I actually thought of that before I did the presentation. I wanted to disclaim that I put all tweets out there because that's where I am most active through NACAC. But really any social media. I mean, NACAC recently put out a video on YouTube. Those, if you've done something, if your school has done something, or a student has done something you really think could be effective in the policy space, YouTube can be helpful. Instagram, Facebook, it really just depends. I think sometimes what I tend to want to do is look at where my target really is. Like, if you look at a state legislator and that state legislator has a Twitter account, but they've only tweeted like 5 times since 2008, but they have a Facebook page and like it's bursting at the seams, then that dictates where you go. So yeah, I kind of put everything through Twitter. Twitter does tend to be the most conversational, and you see a lot of tagging and cross sort of referencing, but it really, you just got to kind of look where your audience is. Yeah,
great ideas there. Any questions right now for anybody else? I see anything in the chat.
I don't have a question, but I just want to say that this session has been awesome. And I really want to thank you, David, for being here and for being such a great resource to us and to our committee and our constituents. And we're just really thankful and appreciative of the work that you've done.
Well, you're most welcome, and I want to thank you all because in my 21 years here at NACAC, I've said it a million times. It's the reason I'm able to do what I do is because of people like you. So I want to thank all of you for getting involved, for being a leader, for spending your precious time, advocating on behalf of yourselves and your students. So really, really grateful.
Hey, it's all about the students. I mean, that's what we're all here for, and to also help one another out too in the profession. Yeah, it's really a team effort, and with everybody here. All right. So that being said, I know that Karini and myself might be reaching out to you, David, with some additional questions from more that wonk point of view. I think, I mean, just amazing things that you've put out here, genuinely blown away. So again, echoing what Karini said, thank you so much. But I think we're going to end the session here. And so let us know if you have any additional questions. Again, we'll be meeting again on January 28th for AWS number 4. But hope everyone has an absolutely wonderful day. And if you're seeing this before all the holidays coming up with the new year, happy holidays.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day and happy holiday season. Bye-bye. Okay, looks like there's just us and Jay is here.
You can end the recording for people.